Well, hello, everybody. It's wonderful to see you and wonderful to have you here. And thank you to Raja Mohan, who's visiting us from India, for finding the time to be here with us at IE University. We have a few minutes for a quick conversation. And right off the bat, my first question has to be about the Indo-Pacific, about China, the role of India in the region. We look at events in the Indo-Pacific with great concern from this part of the world, the rising tensions between China and the United States over Taiwan and over other dossiers in the region. What is your take of developments in the Indo-Pacific? Where do you see the region headed, particularly on the security front and the security agenda? And in particular, what do you think India's role is and is going to be in the near future? Because it seems to us that India is going to play a fundamental role in how security is structured and governed in the region.
First of all, thank you for hosting me. It's wonderful to be in your campus here. It's very impressive and very inspirational as well. I think we are going through really a huge transformation in the Indo-Pacific. I would say three quick developments. One, I think growing Chinese military power has threatened America's forward military presence and fundamentally raising questions in the region. How do we organize security? Because if you remember, the Americans were sitting on the first island chain, running all the way from Japan to Southeast Asia. So the US is rethinking its strategy. Second, we talk about rise of Asia. Actually, China has risen faster than its neighbors. So in a way, all this framing of East versus West, Asia versus Europe, it doesn't hold because the rise of China has created contradictions within Asia. Because the China that believes that it is so strong and so powerful, that it can actually dominate the space in Asia, and that it could be happy to see the Americans back home, and that within Asia, it becomes the dominant power. But my sense is Asia has intense nationalisms. Chinese are not the only ones with nationalists. The Japanese, the Indians, the Vietnamese, none of them would want to trade their newly found independence. Because most of us, Japan is different, most of us are recently decolonized. We're not simply waiting for a new hegemon to come and put us back into a subaltern status. So I think there is a backlash against Chinese attempt at constructing a China-centric regional sphere. And that's why we now, paradoxically, 70 years after colonial age ended, many Asians are looking to Europe and European partnership, Western partnership to ensure stability in this region, because it can no longer be constructed merely in a purely Asian sense. That's why we need the US to stay here. We also need the Europeans who have not paid attention to, once the decolonization took place, largely Europe has turned inwards. But many of us would want the Europeans to come in and play a larger role in stabilizing this new geography of the Indo-Pacific.
I have a follow-up question on this, which is on the Quad, the alignment, this arrangement with the Japanese, with the Indians, the Australians, the Americans. Do you see that also as a consequence of this sort of element of balancing in the regional dynamics, or is it different? And AUKUS maybe might also be sort of another sort of this architecture piece in the region, which I think it's fair to say is a consequence of the disproportionate rise of China, the particularly accentuated rise of China and the effects it has in the region. What's your reading of these belts of institutions that are being built?
Exactly. I think you got it exactly right. We thought at the end of the Cold War, there were no real conflicts. America and China were best partners. Europe was involved in Chinese businesses. Japan and China were very close. India and China were getting along. That was a phase in which the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, became the fulcrum around which a whole new institutional architecture was being developed. It became ASEAN Regional Forum, ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, bringing the other countries in, and finally the East Asia Summit, which brought the ASEAN and all the major powers together to advance towards a new architecture in the region. But I think the rise of China and its assertive posture on the regional issues today, I think, is breaking down the old architecture. And that ASEAN itself finds it impossible to deal with the new contradictions. And that's the reason why we have the Quad, the Quadrilateral Forum, and the AUKUS, which is the Australia, UK, US partnership. So I think new institutions are beginning to come. But we should not frame it as Quad and AUKUS against ASEAN, but as supplementing the ASEAN's role in producing regional coalitions which can actually deal with a completely new reality which exists today.
I have also a follow-up question on this and on India's role. So if we're headed, I'm not sure if this is a diagnosis that you agree with, but if we are headed to a G2 world with China, the United States being these very prominent actors on security, on economics, and it's a very dialectical, it's a very dialectic relationship, no, between these two countries. Would India remain a non-aligned country, right? Is India, are we to think of it again as non-aligned? And I want to link this with a global South question, because in this world of blocs, where does the global South sit? Where is Latin America? Where is Africa? There are major, major implications for a China-US collision, for the climate agenda, for the development agenda, for issues that are extremely dear to countries in these parts of the world. I sense that there'll be a lot of resistance for alignment because of the sheer cost associated with this for these countries. So that's a double question. You know, where does India, particularly given its history on the non-aligned movement and its position it's a global South, it's a southern country in the world. How do you see these pieces sort of playing out?
I would say three things. I mean, I think one, the G2 world looked a real possibility until a decade ago, when things seem the US and China can work together and solve the world's problems. But today, I think the principal contradiction in the international system today is between US and China. While there are people in the US who want to engage China, prevent the competition from being a conflict, the internal contradiction between Chinese economy, Chinese geopolitics, and the American position in Asia, I think that's made the principal contradiction. A China that would have been in a reasonable state of engagement with its own neighbors would have been in a very good position to deal with that contradiction. But unfortunately for them, they have alienated a number of the neighbors, which I think has opened the door for Japan to strengthen its alliance with the United States. For India, which was always non-aligned, today finds the principal contradiction is with China. Therefore, I think the US and Indian interests today are far more aligned than ever before. But we wouldn't want a return to Cold War. And that's where the question of global South, and that India would want to contribute to the stabilization of the region, because ultimately we have to live with China. China is our neighbor. We can't wish them away, nor can the Chinese wish us away. So we have to learn to live with China. And I think we would ideally like a China that is not expansionist, a China that is willing to work with its neighbors, to be able to produce a new architecture in which it's not a Chinese would like to throw the Americans out of Asia. I don't think that's possible. We would like to keep them in. So we have to imagine an architecture where the region can live at peace with itself. And the broader question, the third aspect of the Indo-Pacific that you talked, as the global South that you talked about, I think the West had neglected much of the global South. In the last 3 decades, either it was simply lecturing them on what are the principles they should follow, or to simply put conditionalities, sanctions on everything. So the Europe and the US gave up the classical statecraft, and I think ceded a lot of ground to Russia and China. For example, it's very difficult to get the Africans and the Asians to back the European position on Ukraine, because they say, look, where were you all these days? I mean, you had nothing for us. You had no engagement with us. And the Chinese and the Russians have moved in a big way. So I think we have a big challenge. And I think there too, in India that can work with the West as well as the global South to produce a new bridge between South and the West. I think that will be one new role that India is going to.
Well, it's a fascinating challenge. No, this concept you were mentioning before, we sat down on the southwestern country. Sort of this role of bridge building and containing maybe the worst excesses of a bipolar arrangement and a collision between China and the US. Very final question, because we're running out of time. I have to ask you about Ukraine, India's position on Ukraine. I think the international community, particularly through the votes at the General Assembly and others, has clearly stated that what we're witnessing in Ukraine is a violation of state sovereignty and its territorial integrity. I think there is growing evidence that there are human rights violations and war crimes being committed on the ground. I think this is a very difficult set of actions to defend or to support in any way. Sometimes I think India's actions over the past few months have been interpreted as enabling or tolerating events on the ground in Ukraine. So if you could give us a few sort of points of color on the Indian position on this, because it's also very relevant as a precedent for what we might see let's hope not, in the Taiwan Straits, and on Chinese behavior in the region maybe sometime from now?
First of all, I would say Indian abstentions at the UN and its reluctance to criticize Russian aggression is not an endorsement of Russian actions by any chance. So I think in all the Indian explanation of its vote in the UN Security Council, we made it very clear, look, we strongly support the UN Charter. As a developing country, as a country from the global south, we have a much greater stake in preserving the sovereignty of the existing territorial system. Because we see what Russia has done to Ukraine is exactly what China is trying to do to India, of seizing territory, altering borders by unilateral action. So I don't think there is any fundamental difference in principle. That brings me to the second point, which is, look, we are stuck with Russia. So if you want to say, we have a Russian headache, a headache that comes from path dependence, as a political scientist might say. For 60 years, we bought Russian weapons because the West would not sell weapons to us for a long time. Now things are slightly different. So I think we are stuck with the dependence on Russia. And we are in the middle of a head-to-head conflict with China on this long and disputed Himalayan frontier. So I think India is not in a position at this time where almost 70% of its inventory, military inventory, depends on Russian spare parts and Russian supplies and Russian pipeline of support. So therefore we are stuck with it. So I think it is a question of managing that navigation. And our Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, talks about India eventually producing weapons at home with the support of European and the American capital, and the recent agreement where the Airbus Spain is going to produce a military transport aircraft in India. I think that's the beginning. I think that's the way to go. But I think we have a problem, and over the next decade, hopefully we can move away from it. Third, we fully understand, what happened in Ukraine could happen in Asia. That is, if a nuclear weapon power takes the territory of a neighbor, and then if the neighbor tries to defend itself, say we'll use nuclear weapons, it's a huge, huge problem. There, I think that's the reason why we want Europe to succeed. We want Europe to win, because if Europe loses against Russia, it will boost enormously the confidence of China. Because don't forget, Russia and China are in an alliance without limits. So if Russia can get away with what it has done in Ukraine, I would say we will face the music tomorrow in Asia from the Chinese. So in the interim, on the question of oil, for example, look, I think Europe continues to buy oil. You are tied in a geographic condition with the Russians. Cheap Russian gas has been a major supporter of European competitiveness. But I think, so when people talk about India benefiting, I don't think we are benefiting it. India imports 90% of its oil, and our economy, very inflation sensitive, and inflation is oil sensitive. So I think we're managing the situation. And I think we need better understanding from Europe. And I think Europe too needs better understanding of the regional considerations. For example, today, most of us in Asia, Africa, Latin America deal with the consequences of the Ukraine war. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That is high price of food, high price of fertilizer, scarcity of oil. So I think if you say, I'll just conclude with this thought. I mean, if the Pope sitting in Rome can believe NATO expansion was the problem, it tells you how much propaganda space the West has lost. So I think we need to reach out and engage, while at the same time limiting the damage from this intelligently. And I think the Americans are being quite sensitive to this, working closely with India to work with the global South to produce better outcomes.
Well, I'm very grateful for your answers. Thank you for your time. I know you have a session with our students now, and I'm also grateful for that. And thank you everybody for following and for following this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you very much again for hosting me.